The mountain fog had not yet lifted over Asheville when the private elevator doors slid open on the top floor of the Ashcroft Grove Tower, and in less than a minute, a secret buried for more than 20 years would rise to the surface. A tired single father carrying nothing but a folder of medical bills and a resignation letter he had not yet worked up the courage to sign had wandered into the one hallway in the building he was never supposed to reach. His flannel shirt was faded but freshly ironed, his work boots were cracked at the toe but polished the night before, and his hands carried the permanent calluses of a man who had spent years fixing other people's wiring so his daughter could keep hers. He had no idea that the woman waiting behind that door had spent her entire adult life searching for a face exactly like his. When she saw him, the most powerful CEO in the pharmaceutical industry stopped breathing. Her confident expression collapsed into something raw and unguarded, and for the first time in 20 years, Vivian Cole felt the past reach across the room and take hold of her. Before this story continues, if you believe that kindness, second chances, and the quiet decisions no one sees can change an entire family's future, please like this video, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, share this story with someone who needs a little hope this week, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Now, let's begin. Marcus Webb never imagined that 34 would be the age he'd be starting over from nothing. 6 years earlier, he had been a licensed electrician with a steady contract at a regional utility company, a modest house on the edge of West Asheville, and a wife named Marianne who filled every room she walked into with laughter. They had a daughter together, a bright, stubborn, endlessly curious little girl named Wren, who was born in the spring and named for the small mountain bird that used to nest outside their bedroom window. For 4 years, life was not extravagant, but it was whole. Then Marianne started getting tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The diagnosis came 8 months later, and it came too late. Marcus spent every dollar they had saved, then every dollar he could borrow, chasing treatments that were never going to be enough. When Marianne passed, Wren was 5 years old, and Marcus was left standing in an empty house with a mortgage he couldn't carry and a little girl who needed him to be steady even when the ground beneath him had disappeared. He sold the house within the year. He and Wren moved into a small rented duplex near Hayward Road, the kind of place with a leaking roof the landlord promised to fix and never did. Marcus took every job he could find. He rewired garages, repaired ceiling fans, replaced breaker panels in buildings that hadn't been up to code in decades. Some months he worked 6 jobs at once just to keep the lights on in his own home, which felt like a cruel joke for a man who spent his days making sure other people's lights stayed on. Through all of it, Wren was the reason he got up every morning. She had her mother's stubborn chin and her father's quiet patience, and she filled the walls of their small duplex with drawings, houses with gardens, families holding hands, and in nearly every picture, a tall man in a cape standing next to a little girl with a crown. "That's you and me," she told him once. "You're the strong one. I'm the princess who doesn't need saving, because you already saved me." He kept every drawing folded inside an old metal toolbox, tucked beneath his wrenches and wire strippers, because on the hardest days, that box was the only thing that reminded him why he kept going. Then, 3 months before this story begins, Wren started getting tired the way her mother once had. It started small. She stopped wanting to run at recess. Then came the bruises that appeared without explanation, the fevers that lingered too long, the pale look that never quite left her cheeks even after a full night's sleep. Marcus told himself it was nothing, because he could not survive the alternative. But a father knows his child's body the way he knows the sound of his own truck engine, and something was wrong. The pediatric hematologist at Mission Hospital delivered the diagnosis on a Tuesday afternoon in a small consultation room with a box of tissues placed a little too obviously on the table between them. Wren had a rare and aggressive form of childhood leukemia, one that did not respond well to the standard treatment protocols. Her best chance, the doctor explained carefully, was an experimental targeted therapy currently in clinical trials, a drug developed by a biotech company based right there in Asheville. Cole Biotech. Marcus had passed the company's gleaming glass headquarters 100 times on his way to job sites without ever knowing that the name on the building would soon hold his daughter's life in its hands. What followed were the hardest 10 weeks of Marcus Webb's life. The clinical trial had strict enrollment criteria, and Wren's case was flagged as complicated. Her insurance, a bare-bones plan Marcus could barely afford, did not cover experimental treatment, and the trial's philanthropic sponsorship slots, the ones reserved for families who could not pay, were already full. He called every number he could find. He wrote to every foundation, every hospital social worker, every charity with children or cancer in its name. He filled out applications at 3 in the morning after 12-hour shifts, Wren asleep in the next room, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm he had started counting out of fear. He was turned down by the hospital's financial assistance office, who told him his income was $11 over the qualifying threshold, $11 that came from a Saturday job he'd taken specifically to pay for Wren's asthma inhaler. He was turned down by 2 national children's cancer charities, both of which had exhausted their annual funding by March, their representatives kind on the phone and utterly powerless to help. He was turned down by his own insurance company, twice, on appeal, the second denial arriving in a manila envelope on the same day Wren lost her first eyelash to the early rounds of standard chemo. He was turned down by a private foundation connected to Cole Biotech itself, informed by a form letter, not even a phone call, just a form letter, that the trial's compassionate use slots for the year had already been allocated to other families. He tried the local news, once, filling out an online form for a segment about families in medical crisis, and never heard back. He tried a crowdfunding page a coworker set up for him, and it raised $412 in 3 weeks, mostly from other electricians who didn't have much to give but gave it anyway. He sold his late wife's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry either of them had ever owned worth anything, and put the money toward a specialist consultation that ended, ultimately, in the same answer he kept receiving everywhere else, promising treatment, wrong zip code, wrong income bracket, wrong moment in a very long line. Piece by piece, every door that might have saved his daughter closed in his face, until it felt to Marcus like the entire kingdom of medicine in this country, every hospital, every insurer, every foundation and institution that was supposed to exist for people exactly like him, had looked at his daughter's file, run the numbers, and decided quietly that she simply wasn't the exception they were prepared to make that year. Not out of cruelty, most of them would have said. Just policy. Just criteria. Just the way the system was built. But policy doesn't explain itself to a 6-year-old asking why her hair is falling out, and criteria doesn't sit up with a frightened child at 2 in the morning. Only Marcus did that, night after night, running out of both money and time in equal measure. He did not tell Wren any of this. Every night he sat at the edge of her bed and told her that Daddy was working on it, that they had a plan, that everything was going to be fine, because that was the promise he had made to Marianne the day she died, that Wren would never carry the weight he was carrying. It was a friend from a job site, a fellow electrician named Otis who occasionally picked up event work at the Grove Park Inn, who mentioned there was a temp opening for an emergency wiring repair before a big fundraising gala that weekend. The pay was good, and Marcus needed every extra dollar he could find before the trial's next enrollment deadline. He took the job without hesitation. What Marcus did not know, what almost no one outside a small circle of Cole Biotech's board knew, was that the gala he had been hired to work was not an ordinary fundraiser. It was the public unveiling of the very clinical trial that had turned his daughter away, a closed-door donor event at the Grove Park Inn to raise money for a new pediatric research wing. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the reclusive founder and CEO of Cole Biotech, Vivian Cole, had agreed to appear in person. Vivian was 41 years old, and to the outside world she was untouchable, brilliant, disciplined, and famously private. She had taken her father's small, failing research lab, a 2-room operation above a defunct print shop on the edge of downtown Asheville, and built it into one of the most respected biotech companies on the East Coast, developing therapies that had saved thousands of children exactly like Wren Webb. Business magazines loved to run her photograph beside headlines about self-made success, always leaving out the word inherited, always framing her as a woman who had built something from nothing, when the truth, buried somewhere she had never let herself look too closely, was more complicated than that. Vivian never attended public events. She sent executives, spokespeople, carefully rehearsed doubles who could recite the company's mission statement without flinching, anyone but herself, and the industry had long whispered theories about why the woman behind so much life-saving work refused to stand in front of a camera. Some said she was simply shy. Some said it was trauma from a flood that had nearly killed her as a teenager, the same flood that had made her, decades later, funnel millions into disaster relief funds without ever explaining why. The truth was quieter and heavier than any headline had ever guessed. Vivian Cole did not avoid the spotlight because she was afraid of people looking at her. She avoided it because she was afraid someone, someday, would ask her the one question about her father's company she had never been able to answer honestly, and she had spent 20 years making sure no one ever got the chance. The truth was simpler and heavier than anyone guessed. Vivian Cole had spent over 20 years carrying a secret her father left behind when he died, one she had never had the courage, or the evidence, to fully unravel. That evening, hours before she was due to speak, Vivian retreated to a private consultation suite on the second floor, the one place she'd been promised absolute privacy. She stood at the window watching the fog settle over the Blue Ridge Mountains, holding a small, worn photograph she had carried in her bag for over a decade. It showed two young men standing in front of a cramped, cluttered laboratory, her father, Elias Cole, 30 years younger and grinning with the reckless confidence of a man who believed he was about to change the world, and beside him, an arm slung over her father's shoulder, a man Vivian had never been able to identify. On the back, in her father's handwriting, were 7 words that had haunted her since she found the photograph locked in his desk after his death: the one debt I never paid back. Vivian had asked her father about the man twice while he was alive. Both times, Elias Cole had changed the subject so sharply that she never asked again. It was only after his funeral, going through his private files, that she found fragments of the truth, old lab notebooks with a second name scratched out and rewritten, an early patent application with a co-inventor's signature that had mysteriously vanished from the final filing, a name that appeared nowhere in Cole Biotech's official founding history, Samuel Webb. For years, Vivian told herself it was a dead end, a name attached to a story she would never fully know. Tonight, standing alone with the photograph in her hand, she was no closer to an answer than she had been the day she found it. That was when the door opened. Marcus had been chasing a wiring fault through the second-floor service corridors for the better part of an hour, his phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear as Wren's school called to say she'd had a fever spike and needed to be picked up early. He promised he was 15 minutes out, grabbed his toolbox, and turned down a hallway he did not recognize, his mind entirely on his daughter and not at all on the small brass number plate beside the door in front of him. He pushed it open. He did not find an empty consultation room. He found a woman standing perfectly still at the window, the last light of evening behind her, holding a photograph in trembling hands. "I'm so sorry," Marcus said immediately, already stepping back. "Wrong room, Vivian did not move. She did not tell him to leave. She stared at him the way a person stares at something they have been waiting 20 years to see, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, because the man standing in the doorway had a face she recognized instantly, not from that evening, not from anywhere in her recent memory, but from a photograph she had looked at 1,000 times. The same jaw. The same steady, tired eyes. The same quiet way of carrying himself, like a man used to being overlooked. "What's your name?" Vivian asked, and her voice came out unsteady in a way that had not happened to her in a boardroom in 15 years. Marcus blinked, thrown by the question. "Marcus Webb. I'm sorry, I'm the electrician, I must have taken a wrong turn." "Webb," Vivian repeated, and the room seemed to tilt around her. She crossed the room before she had decided to, closing the distance between them, and held up the photograph with a hand that would not stay still. "Do you know this man?" Marcus looked at the faded picture, at the young man laughing beside a man he didn't recognize in front of a lab he'd never seen, and something in his chest went cold and quiet. "That's my father," he said slowly. "That's Samuel Webb. He passed away when I was 19. I don't understand. Where did you get this?" "It was my father's," Vivian said. "He kept it locked in his desk for 30 years. What followed was not a conversation either of them was prepared to have standing in a hotel consultation suite with a fundraising gala starting downstairs in 90 minutes, but neither of them could walk away from it either. Vivian asked Marcus to sit. He explained, haltingly at first and then with more urgency once he understood who she was, that his father Samuel Webb had been a research chemist, a brilliant, self-taught man who never finished his formal degree but who could see chemical structures the way other people saw sheet music. Samuel had worked for years alongside a young researcher named Elias Cole in a cramped rented lab space, the two of them chasing a compound that could target diseased cells without destroying healthy ones alongside them, the foundational science, Marcus now realized with a rising, sick feeling, behind the very drug his daughter needed. Marcus had grown up hearing fragments of the story from his mother before she too passed. How his father and his research partner had built something extraordinary together on almost no money and no institutional backing. How, right as the compound showed its first promising results, something had gone wrong between the two men, a falling out Samuel Webb never fully explained, one that ended with him walking away from the lab, the partnership, and the patent application with his name still officially attached to the research but never present on the final filing. Samuel Webb spent the rest of his life working as a high school chemistry teacher, quietly proud, never bitter in front of his son. But Marcus remembered the framed, unfinished patent application his father kept in a drawer and never spoke about, and the particular silence that fell over their house whenever a certain pharmaceutical company's name appeared on the evening news. "He never told me the company's name," Marcus said quietly. "He never told me any of it, not really. I found the patent papers after he died. I didn't know what to do with them, so I just kept them." Vivian sat with that for a long moment, the photograph resting between them on the small table, and then she told him what she had learned from her father's private files after his death, that Elias Cole had filed the patent for their shared discovery under his name alone during a period when Samuel Webb was caring for a sick relative and had temporarily stepped back from the lab, that Elias had always intended. He wrote in one surviving letter that was never sent, to correct the record and bring Samuel back in as an equal partner once the company was stable, and that he never did, because success came fast and the truth became inconvenient, and eventually it became a secret he decided to carry to his grave rather than face. He called it the one debt he never paid back, Vivian said, her voice breaking slightly. "I always thought it was about money. I didn't understand until right now that it was about a person. About your father. About you." Marcus sat in stunned silence. The company that held his daughter's life in its clinical trial protocols, the company that had turned Wren away because her family didn't fit the funding criteria, was standing on the foundation of his father's stolen work. "There has to be a mistake," Vivian said quietly, almost to herself. "Every family that applies for compassionate use goes through a review committee. I sit on that committee's oversight board. I would have seen her name." "There's no mistake," Marcus said, and something in him, worn thin by 10 weeks of form letters and phone calls on hold, finally cracked open. "Her file's probably in a stack somewhere with 100 others just like it. That's not a knock on you, I don't even really know you. But I've called every number your company has listed. I've written letters. I've filled out the same application for different times because they kept saying pieces were missing. Nobody at your company has ever once picked up a phone and told me no themselves. It's always been a form. A policy. A threshold I'm $11 over." His voice caught, and he hated that it did, because he had promised himself a long time ago that he would not fall apart in front of strangers. "She's 6. She likes to draw pictures of me in a cape like I'm some kind of superhero, and I can't even get a company that makes the exact medicine she needs to look at her file for more than 30 seconds. Vivian said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence Marcus watched something shift across her face, not pity, which he had grown to recognize and quietly resent over the last 10 weeks, but something closer to recognition, as if he had just described, without knowing it, the precise failure she had spent her whole career terrified of becoming. Then his phone rang again. Wren's school, calling a second time. "I have to go," Marcus said, standing abruptly, the weight of everything suddenly too much. "My daughter is sick. She has leukemia. She needs a drug your company makes, and we were turned down for the trial 10 weeks ago because we don't qualify for the funding, and I have spent every single day since then trying to find another way, and I can't do this right now. I'm sorry. I have to go get her." Vivian stood as well, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something break through the careful, guarded discipline she had built her entire life around. "Wait," she said. "Please. Let me help." "Everybody says that," Marcus said, already halfway to the door, not unkindly, just tired in a way that had stopped believing in the sentence a long time ago. "I know," Vivian said. "I'm asking you to let me be the first one who means it." Something about the plainness of it, the lack of any polish or performance, made Marcus pause in the doorway. He didn't answer her. He didn't have it in him to hope out loud, not with Wren waiting, feverish, in a school nurse's office across town. He simply nodded once, gave her his number because she asked for it, and he was too rushed to think of a reason not to, and left. Marcus did not wait. He could not. He left the Grove park-in with his toolbox still in hand and his heart pounding somewhere in his throat, and he drove to Wren's school with his hands shaking on the wheel, replaying every word Vivian Cole had said, unable to decide whether what had just happened was the strangest coincidence of his life or the beginning of something he didn't yet have the language for. He found Wren in the school nurse's office, pale and small in an oversized chair, her forehead damp, her eyes finding his the moment he walked in with the particular relief only a child feels when a parent finally arrives. He carried her to the truck, and she fell asleep against the door before they'd even left the parking lot, and Marcus drove home with tears he refused to let fall, because falling apart was a luxury he had not been able to afford in 6 years. He did not expect to hear from Vivian Cole again. Powerful people, in Marcus's experience, made big emotional gestures in the moment and then let the ordinary weight of their lives pull them back to where they started. He told himself not to hope for anything, because hope, when it didn't come through, cost more than he had left to spend. He was wrong. Vivian Cole did not sleep that night. She sat in her office long after the gala downstairs had ended, the photograph of her father and Samuel Webb propped against her desk lamp, and she did something she had spent 20 years avoiding. She opened every one of her father's old private files and read through them properly, methodically, without flinching away from what she might find. What she found confirmed everything Marcus had told her and more. Her father's early notebooks showed Samuel Webb's handwriting threaded through nearly half of the foundational research, entire pages of chemical structures and testing notes in a hand that was not Elias Cole's, careful and precise, the handwriting of a man who had never finished college but who understood the science better than most people who had. Cross-referencing the notebooks against the original 1990s patent filing, Vivian found the exact page where the second signature line had once existed and had been struck through in white correction fluid, the kind you could still faintly see under better lighting if you knew to look for it, which no one, in 30 years, ever had. She found payroll records showing Samuel Webb had been paid as a lab technician, a fraction of what a co-inventor would have earned, for the final 18 months of the research that became the company's flagship compound. She found a single photograph, tucked behind a filing cabinet drawer that had clearly not been opened in years, of her father and Samuel Webb standing on either side of a chalkboard covered in molecular diagrams, both men grinning, neither of them yet aware of what the next decade would cost one of them. And she found the letter, a partially drafted letter, dated 11 years before Elias's death and never sent, addressed simply to Sam, in which Elias Cole apologized for what he called the cowardice of a young man who chose his own name over the truth, and promised that once the company had the resources, Samuel Webb's family would be given what they were owed, not as charity, Elias had written in his own uneven hand, but as what belonged to them by right, plainly and without conditions. The letter sat unfinished mid-sentence, as though Elias had simply put down his pen one evening and never picked it back up. The letter was never mailed. Elias Cole died 8 years later, having never made the call, never written the check, never corrected a single document, leaving his daughter a company built partly on another man's uncredited brilliance and a debt he'd been too afraid to pay while he still could. Vivian sat with the unfinished letter until the sky outside her office window turned from black to grey to the pale gold of early morning over the mountains, and somewhere in those hours, the question she had been almost too afraid to ask herself for 20 years finally arrived with total clarity. Was she going to be the second Cole to let this debt outlive the man who owed it, or was she going to be the one who finally paid it? She already knew her answer. She had known it, really, from the moment Marcus Webb walked through the wrong door. By morning, Vivian had made 3 decisions, and she made all 3 before the sun had fully risen over the mountains. The first was legal. She called Cole Biotech's general counsel at 6 in the morning and instructed him to begin an immediate, formal review of the original 1990s patent filings, with the explicit goal of restoring Samuel Webb's name as co-inventor of record and establishing a retroactive royalty trust for his surviving heir, Marcus Webb, reflecting decades of the compound's commercial success. It was not a gesture. It was a correction, decades overdue, and Vivian made clear it was not up for negotiation with the board. The second decision was medical, and it was the one that mattered most that morning. She personally called the head of the clinical trial program and instructed that Wren Webb be enrolled immediately, not through the standard compassionate use allocation, but through a newly created emergency provision Vivian authorized on the spot, full treatment, full monitoring, every cost covered by the company, effective immediately, no waiting list, no funding threshold, no appeals process required. The third decision was the one that would surprise the entire industry days later, when word began to spread. Vivian announced that the new pediatric research wing being funded through that weekend's gala would be named not for her father, not for Cole Biotech, but for Samuel Webb, the uncredited chemist whose work had quietly saved thousands of children's lives under someone else's name for over 20 years. Marcus was replacing a breaker panel in a garage off Riverside Drive 2 days later when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. It was Wren's oncologist, and her voice was different than it had been in every previous call, lighter, almost startled by her own good news. "Mr. Webb, I need you to come to the hospital. Wren has been formally enrolled in the trial, effective immediately. All costs are covered. We can start treatment protocols as early as tomorrow morning." Marcus stood in that stranger's garage with a wrench still in his hand and had to sit down on an overturned bucket because his legs would not hold him. The treatment that followed was not instantaneous or without its hard days. Wren's illness had progressed, and the road ahead still required real courage from a 6-year-old and her father. There were nights when her fever spiked and Marcus sat in a hospital recliner that didn't fully recline, counting her breaths the way he had for months, terrified all over again despite every reassurance from her medical team. There were mornings when Wren was too nauseated to eat the pancakes Marcus brought from the cafeteria specifically because they were her favorite, and he sat beside her bed anyway, eating them himself so she wouldn't feel bad about it, cracking jokes until she managed a small, tired laugh. But for the first time in months, they were walking that road with a door open in front of them instead of one closing behind them. Wren's numbers began to improve within the first month. Her color came back. Her appetite returned in stubborn, funny bursts. She went through a phase of wanting only grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles, never squares, and Marcus learned to make them exactly right without being asked twice. She started drawing again, and one afternoon in the hospital's small activity room, surrounded by other kids working on their own pictures at a long plastic table, she handed her father a new picture, the same tall man in a cape, the same little girl beside him. But this time there was a third figure standing nearby, a woman with dark hair Wren had never formally met but had heard her father mention once, softly. On the drive home from the inn the night everything changed. "That's the lady who helped us," Wren explained matter-of-factly, coloring in the woman's shoes with a purple crayon, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Every hero needs a friend." Marcus kept that drawing in the same metal toolbox where he'd kept every other one, except now it sat on top, not buried beneath the wrenches, because for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to hide the reason he kept going. He could just look at it. Vivian visited the hospital twice that month, quietly, without press, without announcement, simply as a woman who had found, after 20 years of searching, some way to finally set down a weight her father had carried and never put down himself. She and Marcus did not become instant friends, and neither of them pretended the years of hardship or the decades of injustice could be undone in a single gesture. But something steadier began to grow between the Webb and Cole families, built not on guilt or obligation but on the plain, simple fact that the truth, once it was finally spoken out loud, no longer had to be carried alone. 6 months later, Cole Biotech's new pediatric research wing opened its doors, the name Samuel Webb Pavilion carved into stone above the entrance, and Marcus stood at the ribbon cutting with Wren's small hand in his, watching a company finally make right what it had spent 2 decades avoiding. Reporters at the event kept asking Vivian Cole why, after years of avoiding public appearances entirely, she had chosen this moment to step forward. She gave the same answer every time, simple and unguarded in a way none of them expected from her. "Because someone walked through the wrong door," she said, and reminded me that the right thing to do was never actually complicated. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to open it. Wren, standing beside her father in a small dress with a paper crown she had insisted on wearing, tugged on Vivian's sleeve and asked if she could see the new hospital wing named after her grandfather. Vivian knelt down to her eye level and took her hand. "Come on," she said. "Let me show you where it all began." And somewhere behind them, Marcus Webb, once turned away by every door in the kingdom of medicine that was supposed to help people like him, finally exhaled the breath he had been holding for 6 long years. If this story moved you tonight, don't scroll away just yet. Take a moment to like this video, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and share it with someone who could use a reminder that kindness has a way of finding its way back around. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people, unexpected doors, and the decisions that change everything, make sure you're subscribed, because we have so many more waiting for you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.